That's very good.
Barrel vault, the dome there here, you know, the ceiling with all these lovely decorations of flowers and birds representing paradise. I think most of you know the way these things are made in mosaics. They're little glass cubes called tesserae, just like little dices, all different colours. Some of the cubes have got gold or silver leaf or very precious stones in them to give very rich colours. And the art of setting them in the cement or stucco base or bed, let's call it, is very, very complex. You have to set them at different angles, the little dices or tesserae, so that they catch the light. And it's generally considered, isn't it, that it's in Ravenna you get the finest mosaics were ever made in Europe, mostly from a quite early period. Now, above the Christ there, with the cross over his shoulder again, the warrior Christ, spreading the Christian faith, and you can see he's got the book open in his hand there, and he's wearing a costume rather like a Byzantine emperor. So he's looking like the imperial warrior in a sense. The book you can see, anybody translate it?
I am the way.
Yes. Yes. Truth. That's right. So I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right? The gospel is the main central idea there. And he's got this wonderful lion. The lion looks a little bit unhappy there on the left. He's squashing the lion. Lion, a symbol of evil there, and the snake on the right there, also, you know, evil being trampled underfoot. And in Psalm 91, actually, there is a mention, you know, of the lion and the snake being trampled underfoot there. The private chapel of the local bishops. The plan is a Greek cross again. You know, it's got the two arms at right angles, equidistant in size. Now, paradise and the cross of redemption, victory over death, in the central part of the field. But then in the central part of the chapel itself, you know, of the crossing area of the mosaics, you've got these four angels standing on the green grass there and supporting the monogram of Christ, the little badge of Christ there. Now, if you look at that mosaic blue emblem in the centre there, can you see that there's something missing that you normally see in the lettering?
P is a P.
Yes, so it doesn't look like a P, or let's say that's an R, isn't it, in Greek, the letter rho. It's an I, isn't it? It looks like just one vertical line. Right? So it may well be that it was almost an I rather than an R or a P, as we would think of it, right? And then if that's the case, it would be the letter for Christ's first name, Jesus, which is letter I, and then the chi there, the X-looking letter would be for Christos, Christ. Christ in the centre there, in that medallion, that's very beautiful, I think, that image of Christ in the sort of purpley brown costume, unbearded, very youthful, very compelling image of Christ, very realistic that. You've got the same thing repeated over here, on this side of the middle, and on, you know, to the west and the east here, these soffits of the barrel vaults have got images of the 12 apostles, 6 on this side and 6 on another. And in a moment I'll stop talking so you can have a look more closely at the portrayal, the expression and eyes and noses of the apostles, because they're actually very individualised and very, very impressive. We've got James here, Paul, for example. They're all just named, fortunately, in the Latin language. These very compelling, very dignified expressions. You know, the faith of the people who made this, the belief in the historical existence of these men is very, very clear, as we say. Yes, you can see it from a distance.
Chris, if
you come and have a look, there's a picture here. It's taken it. Come round here.
Oh, God,
Look, there it is. Showing what's happening.
Have a look inside this baptistry of Neonius, the baptistry of the Orthodox, right? And the entrance is just through here. Just to mention before we go inside the baptistry itself, if you look at the semicircular apses, right, you find on this two sides of the building here. You may think, well, these look rather low in height, don't you? If you look at the tiled roofs there, you look at the actual height of the brickwork below that level, it's a little bit short for altar places for the apses. And there's a reason for that. The height of this building, or let's say the pavement level originally, was 3 meters deeper than the present site. And this is the case in most of the churches in Ravenna. The original pavement level was much deeper, but because the water table in the rocks, in the soil in Ravenna has risen over the centuries, it's become necessary to raise the level of the pavement itself, and hence the structures have been truncated at the bottom end. It is a very interesting site, very complex. Neonianus, so it's often called Neonian Baptistry. Now, many of the lovely Tuscan Romanesque baptistries of a much later period, they're usually octagonal, like the early Christian or Byzantine ones. You remember Mausoleum, right at this one here, got a big octagonal font in the centre, and people had total immersion, like the Baptists in Britain and America still do, hence these very large octagonal fonts that follow the design of the walls of the structure themselves. You can see that there's this special angle or pulpit here at the end, and that was the pulpit that was used in this case, by the priest to stand in when he baptized the adult people in the space of adults usually baptized. Now, the decoration on the wall and on the vault here is very complex. There has been restoration. Some things have been lost, but most of it has actually survived. There's a whole variety of different colours and different materials, including this creamy coloured stone and stucco work that you see in between the windows. Now, I'll just briefly go through some of the symbols in the series. It's very complex in this programme of symbolism, like most Byzantine churches and baptistries are, and we're going to see a lot of these different programmes today, and tomorrow morning too. If you look at the top there, we've got the central medallion of the baptism of Christ himself in the River Jordan by John the Baptist. Right? You see the figure in the centre of Christ nude in water, with the dove of the Holy Spirit hovering over his head there, and to Christ's left the figure, very athletic, in the goatskin of John the Baptist with a circular dish pouring water on Christ's head. But there's a figure on the right-hand side of Christ there. You see, he's got a green drapery in his hand. Who is he? Well, how's he come? He's not an angel. He has his name to identify on the mosaic. And he's Honorius. Yes, so he's River God. River Jordan there. It's the old Roman pagan and River God standards. So here we've got the River Jordan that appears there. And the victory in their hands. And St. Paul is the one with the narrow face and the brown longer beard. And St. Peter traditionally has got the white hair. From a very early period, this is actually called opus seculae. Opus seculae is one of the ways of doing inlaid decoration in marble of all different colours. There's a lot of this in San Vitale, some of which hasn't survived. So parts of this building actually lost their decoration. The stucco figures between the windows were painted and gilded originally. So although it looks very rich now, it would have looked even richer. Well, that's it. We're going to have a look at the Church of St. Francis and the tomb of Dante before we have our coffee break, right? But I want to point out this restaurant here, the Gatiss, which at the moment you can see is closed. Now, we've got an optional lunch already arranged in another restaurant nearby today for lunch. Now, this evening, for anybody that wants to do it, it's possible for some of us to have a meal in here. I was hoping that the window might be open so that you could see in. It's a place of great character with robust local food. Ladies and gentlemen, to a lot of Italian people, Ravenna signifies not just all the lovely Byzantine mosaics and Byzantine history, but the name of Dante Alighieri, our Florentine friend who wrote the Divine Comedy and lots of works in Latin. Now you may know that poor Dante Alighieri, in 1302, was exiled for political activities in Florence when the city was rife with factions. Dante at the time was one of the 7 priors of Florence, and he happened to be on the wrong side at the wrong time, and he was expelled for life from the city. And he came to the city of Ravenna, and the local ruler of Ravenna at the time, looked after him, gave him a place at court. The new, the much earlier 16th church, which we'll have a look at inside in a moment. So Dante was very fond of the system of order. A great deal about St. Francis He was very clear neoclassical sculpture. You see the inscription on the doorway there, the tomb of the poet Dante, a major literary person in the history of Italy. So there's this lovely relief from the 15th century. Now, and with the rights of monarchy, he wrote a treatise on monarchy, of the heavens and of the waters of Flavius. That's in hell. You remember his book, The Inferno, very popular. Let's go in, shall we? Mille grazie, signore. There you go. We're just going to spend 5 minutes here in the San Francesco Church. This is as you can see, it's a square brick bell tower rather than a round one. It is a very old bell tower of about 1,000 AD. The church itself was built in the 450s originally, but it was converted into a Franciscan church around about 1260. I walked in front of this church here, and the bells were ringing in the bell tower. They're massive bells, and they make a wonderful sonorous noise, and it's a wonderful experience to hear the bells ringing. It's very fascinating, which is a mosaic pavement from the 6th century, and this mosaic fragment in the apse, there's a great depth of water. It's like a swimming pool, actually. And that shows how the water table has risen, as in Venice, so much over the centuries. was just saying to me that this is the place that the guides found most difficult to explain. It's the big church, and the symbolism inside in the mosaics is complicated, and it changes over the periods of which the building is begun. Now, Chris has gone inside to see how many people are in there already. In the meantime, just tell us something about the building. Now, this is known about Sant'Apollinare, but he might have been even a disciple of St. Peter himself, because he was living in the 1st century and apparently came from Syria to evangelize Ravenna towards maybe 90 AD, included actually in the city of Ravenna. Now, the church we've got here was begun in about 500 AD. You'll notice it's got a typical bell tower with circular shape. At the time that this church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo was begun, it was this Theodoric the Great, who was an Arian Catholic, who was in power in the city. The Emperor Justinian, of Constantinople. This church was rededicated. And you would think, oh, it's rededicated now to St. Apollinare. It wasn't. That's the trouble. It was dedicated to St. Martin of Tours, the French bishop. Now, the reason it was dedicated to St. Martin of Tours was that St. Martin of Tours was a pursuer of heretics. And the Byzantine clergy considered that Arians were heretics and declared officially heretics at the Ecumenical Council in the 4th century. So they dedicated the church anew to St. Martin of Tours because he was their symbol of Catholic orthodoxy. Orthodoxy with a small O. Right? So the church is rededicated to St. Martin of Tours. And at that time, it was a beautiful ceiling that had stars in gold painted on the vault itself. Byzantine rule. And that's one of the most fascinating parts. Sorry, 6th century homes with the very early capitals. This ceiling is much later. We know that originally it was lovely blue vault with gold stars. 6th century. Now, unfortunately, because the old Mosaics and the maps can't survive it. It was an earthquake, and so they're all lost. So we have the wood decoration at the front. You'll notice that the windows of the aisles at the lower level and the top level are all similar shape, and they emit a lot of light at all levels. They're very well lit. And we'll see this type of motif again in the Church of Sant'Apollinare in Classe tomorrow, which is even bigger. And it's something more impressive. However, the mosaics here preserved. Right? Now, I mentioned at the top level of the walls of the lane, right at the top there are a series of stories telling the life of Christ, including his miracles on one side, and the passion stories on the other. Now,
Prima
dozen lovely figures of female martyrs. It's very nice house. This looks different. You see the Star of Bethlehem above his head there, the gifts in their hands. This costume they're wearing, what it's trying to represent is the idea of the Persian civilization, because the Persians, the Medes in Persia's antiquity, did have these astrologers, and it's described in the historian Herodotus very early on. So there were very extraordinary astrologers at the court of the Persians, and that's probably the origin of the three magi. Wonderful fitting for pattern, of course, anyway, definitely the trousers. Balthazar, Melchior is usually shown out here as the youngest one, although Balthazar and lots of later paintings, for example, is shown as a black man.
Yes.
Here he's actually white. And because they're moving in procession to the Madonna enchant enthroned, with the four archangels on either side, and again notice the lovely flowers in the bottom below the throne. And the date palms here, surrounding the three magi. Now, I think I might have mentioned in some of the classes that there's this famous document surviving by the priest Angelus of the 9th century, which describes the monuments in Ravenna, including these mosaics. And in this history of Ravenna, written in the 9th century, the names Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar are given. And it's thought that this is the first time ever that these names came into the Christian tradition. They have no biblical origin whatsoever, but they are names documented describing the mosaics. We don't know who dreamt the names up or how the people here in Byzantine and Ravenna discovered the names or whether they made them up, but the origin of the tradition that they had these three names comes from this description of the mosaics here and the names above them. Martyrs on this side, as you approach the archangels, this one here, is not in white like the other figures. He's wearing a purple cloak, and that's because he's somebody very special. Can anybody read the inscription above his head? Yeah, so this is St. Martin of Tours, the first figure there, the Bishop of France in early Christian times, St. Martin of Tours, and that tells us this figure in the mosaic belongs to the period of the middle of the 6th century when the church was rededicated to St. Martin of Tours, the pursuer of Arian heretics, right? So the theory, of Theodoric, but the rest of them are from the later period, right? You can probably see there's a division. If you look at the figure of Gaspar, you see there's a sort of table is round. That's the very first compartment on the top there. But Christ is in purple, the imperial Byzantine colour. To the left, it's very difficult to see. Right at the top there, to the left of the window. You can see the design is very similar, octagonal structure. They would have had originally an octagonal basin inside, which hasn't unfortunately survived, and it's got these apses, semicircular apses on just the four sides. The plain brickwork was never covered with marble, quite large windows only on the level of the structure, a few feet below the pavement, before the water table rose, and so the pavement we're standing on is dry and not waterlogged. Now, a complicated bit of theology there. Now, we'll go and spend a very short time inside. There is a group in there, I think. It's finished now. So we'll have a look. There's only one mosaic surviving, and that's on the ceiling. See, look at Here, we can see the plain brickwork structure, with just the four semicircular apses, and where Dennis is standing is the site of the original basin, which apparently here would have been circular rather than octagonal, thought for total immersion for the areas. And when you look at this ceiling, you might think, just a minute, I've seen this before. It's very similar, isn't it? We saw last year when we saw the very famous baptistry of Neonians, the Orthodox baptistry right next to the cathedral, right, which the decorations were done in that one about 50 years before Theodoric had this baptistry, where the area was decorated. So we don't know what the mosaics were on the walls, because we do know that there would have been mosaics. But here, for the baptistry, we've got the traditional scene of the baptism of Christ by John the Baptist. John the Baptist here is on the right-hand side there, with this curving stick in his hand, and the goatskin costume, and the dove of the Holy Spirit in the assembly on Christ. Christ again is nude, transparent, before. And how the mosaics is his legs, and appearing behind the blue water there. And here we've got our friend, the River Jordan, who's on the left in this case here. It's a much larger figure and subtle than the previous mosaic. Halos for their halos, not their heads, whereas the other one have no halos at all, but they form their martyrs' crowns, as previously, and their faces are individualized. Now, the big difference in the procession with the apostles here and this mosaic, the areas, is that it starts off with St. Peter and St. Paul, each of them flanking the throne of God. And the throne of God is empty, and it has the cross, jeweled cross of redemption, or salvation on the throne. And that's a symbol, really, of God the Father himself. So that's, you see there, we've got the scaffold there, we've got this direct decorative throne. To the right of it, we've got St. Peter with his beard, his white hair, and his characteristic hairstyle. And St. Paul on the left there, leading the procession of people coming from that side, from the leftwards towards the throne itself. Now, St. Peter, the figure on the right, doesn't have the martyr's crown, so instead he's got his usual attribute, the double piece, as gatekeeper of the kingdom. And Belisarius captured this city of Ravenna, church in Ravenna, right? Very, very different from the rest of the houses known, as you can see. The main structure of the building is brick, but it's octagonal. It's actually in the shape of the early Christian churches, which were oratories or the places of burial of martyrs, otherwise known as martyria, which are normally circular or octagonal, but not basilican, i.e. rectangular. We've seen so far the churches in Ravenna have been with a nave and an aisle on either side. D, and was martyred in Bologna, not very far away. His remains were translated or brought to the city of Ravenna maybe in the 5th century AD, and by the 6th century AD there was a great cult honouring this Saint Vitale as a martyr. Right. Now, it was by about 520 or 530 AD that this church here in brick was actually constructed, and the bishop during that period was called Bishop Classe, which happens to be in the church. A coincidence. It was begun in the period of Bishop Classe, and it was actually dedicated. What's the stairs, please? Here in the presbytery of the church. Just refresh yourself of the memory of the mosaics. If you know them already, as some of you do. Now here we're at the east end, of course, of the altar. Hey, can you hear me all right? It's very difficult, there's so many people in the church. So remember that the central area is octagonal, and out of 7 of the lines of the octagon opening up these lovely curved screens or apses with galleries of columns on 2 orders, and there's a lovely semicircular apses on the level above. Now, the first floor story you're seeing there, the second rows of windows, there might be windows just below the dome, which is decorated later at the right side. Remember, the surfaces of the decorated originally in mosaic. Under the bishop Maxentius, Maxentius's portrait can be found in the famous mosaic, right in the apse of the east end there, at the level of the church was dedicated. The emperor was so next to opposite the image of Justinian, the emperor in Constantinople, we've got Theodora here in a wonderful purple costume and her imperial crown ornamented. She was a very, very important person in the history of Byzantium. She was a former actress and acrobat, a person of very humble origin who rose to the peak of success and power in Constantinople. She's shown here with her chamberlain, a wonderful portrait face to the left as we look at her, and her maids of honour, all in brightly coloured costumes, different coloured costumes to the right. So you can see her there in the middle, holding the golden chalice, representing the blood in the Mass. And on the right-hand side, she has some very pretty maids of honour at her court, ceremonial, and she's shown some sort of courtyard with a lovely fountain. And the chamberlain on the left-hand side is opening the curtain so that the figures can process eastward. So they're actually sort of slowly moving towards Christ. And perhaps the idea is that they hope to reach heaven and salvation as Vitale and the Classians have already done, earlier on in the century. So beautiful rich colours there. I think you can see the colours very well today. Although you might not be able to hear me, you can see, I think, the colours very well today. This lunette here above the 2 columns, again we have the idea of images of Old Testament sacrifice, prefiguring the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. We've got Abel, the son who sacrificed the lamb to God there. His sacrifice, remember, was accepted by God in Genesis, whereas his brother Cain's sacrifice was not. So he offers the lamb up to God. There's the hand of God the Father, who's in the middle of the sky there. Melchizedek on the right is not so familiar. Again, that's from the Old Testament. Melchizedek, the priest, came out to meet Abraham at Salem and gave him wine and bread to sustain him. But of course here, the idea is that Melchizedek is actually placing the bread on the altar where there's already a sort of chalice with wine in. You see, so this is an idea of linking the Old Testament with the Mass in relationship to Christ with the bread and the wine, the stories of food for human beings in the Old Testament, sustenance in wine, and then we've got Moses in the burning bush there, see the flames
on the rocks there, sorry Victor. And further above there we get two more evangelists. Lovely lion. You see the lion of St. Mark on the right-hand side. This very fierce lion above the figure of St. Mark himself there, to the right-hand side of the open gallery with the lovely Greek marble columns. The carving of the capitals here is very beautiful and very much in the Byzantine style of architecture. But those columns have got nothing directly to do, with the Roman. It's a ceremonial robe. It's known that in the 6th century, in Hagia Sophia, when the clergy and the Patriarch of Constantinople used to process at High Mass, the Emperor and the Empress were in the procession with them, taking the chalice and the paten to the high altar. They were considered immensely spiritual importance in the Byzantine hierarchy. Well, folks, I'm not going to mention anything else, but we've got plenty of time actually, because the last port of call today is 4:45 at the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, which is 5 minutes outside. Now, believe it or not, it's called the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Galla Placidia was the step-sister of the Emperor Honorius, the early Byzantine emperor, around about 400 AD. Galla Placidia, very, very powerful woman, beautiful yellow marble, right over the lower levels on the 4 crosses, or 4 arms of the cross. Actually, this is 19th century replacement for the marble right throughout the lower level of the building. We know that there is need for all of them. The cross of Christ over his shoulders, and a barbecue just on the left. I don't think I need to tell you who he is. This is St. Lorenzo, St. Lawrence, one of the first Christian martyrs, one of the first deacons of the early Christian church. Right. There he is with the white toga on, the gospel in his hand, and the cross of the militant faith of Jesus Christ over his shoulder. He's walking without fear and without, let's say, reluctance to his martyrdom. Remember, he was persecuted under the Christians, under the Roman emperors very early on, and his punishment was put on the gridiron and roasted alive. I'm sure you remember saying that he was not allowed to do this. At one point he said, "Turn me over and do the other side." The cupboard on the left there, you can see it's got the 4 Gospels of Christ labelled Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now, apparently, in the 5th century,
in Ravenna there was a great cult of St. Lawrence as one of the early martyrs. St. Augustine of Hippo, in his letters, refers to a church built nearby by Galla Placidia, which hasn't actually survived.
We've got images of 8, and look at these images of immortality, of drinking the fountain of Christian faith, with the fountain with the doves on either side there. There's a little water dish with 2 white doves feeding there. On that side, on the brunette decoration of mosaics, which is lovely tradition in the classical style, and the Greek key pattern, this sort of zigzag pattern, ornamental border underneath there, and then we've got the Cairo monogram of Jesus Christ with Alpha and Omega. Like most of the buildings, wonderful the cross in his hands. Oh, thanks so much. Isn't it wonderful?
It's a special life.
It's wonderful. And just 6 sheets. Sorry. The sheep 6 in number only. You see how Christ is caressing the muzzle with one of them. Now this is the rocks of paradise. It's rocky. Each rock has flowers or plants growing out. It's pretty peaceful. It's a strange Greek.
Each corner, exactly a good idea. Exactly.
Commercial marine centre. Now, the church that we've got here is one of the most
Impressive in the whole of the Ravenna area. It's in the Basilica hall, with the central nave and the aisle on either side, and it is dedicated, like the church in Ravenna itself, to the first bishop of Ravenna, Sant'Apollinare, a rather misty figure who's supposed to have arrived in this area by sea round about 100 AD.
This church that we're looking at was done in the 30s AD, just before
The recapture of Ravenna by the Byzantines, the Belisarians. And Sant'Apollinare Classe here was actually dedicated in the second year of 559 AD with the Church of San Vitale that in the centre of Ravenna was that we saw yesterday. Remember, it was under the period of the Bishop Maximian and the reign of Justinian of Byzantium. The Church of San Vitale was actually dedicated in the 540s. This church was dedicated in the same year, 549. For that performance, these wooden struts here, you see the wooden struts between the columns, they're being put there specially so that the vibration of the music won't cause any structural problems with the columns, right? And so spacious, so full of light here.
Yes.
Now, normally we can get much closer to the apse, but obviously today we can't get that close. Cinzia's has gone to see if she can put some money to illuminate with machine the mosaics in the apse itself. 6th century, some a little bit later actually, from the 8th century there, on the apse and the triumphal arch, that's the sort of front part of the apse itself that's not curving. That gives us some idea of the original beauty of the church itself. Now, the mosaics are of 2 different periods. The first ones are from the 540s, when the church was dedicated under Maximian, and some other mosaics in the East End there are from the 670s, when the East End apse was actually refurbished. Right. Now, for example, from the earlier period, in the 540s, you'll see we've got 4 bishops between the windows there. And the cross
the gold cross above his head. So there from the early period of the 540s too. You'll notice that flanking Sant'Apollinare, we have sheep, 6 on either side, representing the 12 disciples. Very beautiful. I think also those 12 sheep total represent the flock of Ravenna itself. You know, all the Christians in Ravenna. Those are the 6 sheep flanking the figure of Sant'Apollinare in the apse that's got his hands raised. Now, something very strange in the apse, you may know the story of the mosaics here, what they represent, is the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor. However, we don't see any image of Christ himself, nor do we see images of the 3 apostles, Peter, James and John, who attended Christ on Mount Tabor and witnessed his transfiguration when his garments shone with the Spirit of God. And they're the 2 Old Testament prophets that featured on Mount Tabor, you know, when Christ's robes were glimmering, and we have the presence of God the Father and the presence of the 2 Old Testament prophets. It was the way when Christ showed to his apostles. So he's busted a tiny little image of Christ as in the centre of that gold cross. And that's all we have. So he says, "This is my son," doesn't he? That's what it says in the Bible at the point of the story in the Transfiguration. The cross itself has a little inscription underneath. It says, "Salus Mundi," salvation for the world. And the border around the cross in blue has 99 stars representing infinity. And you see the lovely 99 gold stars in the blue field of the circle around the cross. The whole is an image of paradise, really, but particularly the surrounding cross. It's also lovely, isn't it, how there's rocks there, the 8th century, which shows the bishop of that period and the Emperor Constantine IV, who's giving a special privilege to the bishop of the 8th century for this basilica, and that mosaic.
This is the Augustus Gate at Rimini. Rimini was an important Roman town.
Cities are organised traditionally. Many you know that they're organised so that the main forum is in the centre of 2 streets that make at right angles. And the street that goes from north to south is called the Cardor Hinge, and this main street that goes through the middle of the main square is called the Decumanus. So we're on the far edge of the Decumanus here. That's the street that goes right from the centre of the city from west to east. Right? And in this case we've got the triumphal archway. On the exterior of the archway, as you can see it now, is the direction of the road that goes to Rome. So the archway is placed on the junction of the 2 major systems of roadways that we were mentioning earlier on that go north and west, and also north to south and west to east. The archway that we see is only one single arch, isn't it? And some of you know that in Rome the triumphal arches, one of Constantine and the other one of Septimius Severus, has got 3 arches. Big one in the middle and 2 smaller ones, one on either side. This is rather more modest than that. It's not so much a commemorative arch, it's more of a gateway arch. But apparently in antiquity, on the top level of the marble, before the medieval brick battlements were built, there was actually a marble quadriga statue of Augustus the Emperor who built the arch in 27 AD, driving this chariot with 4 horses, and that was a marble group, rather like the sort of thing that you find on the top of our marble arch, you know, in London. So this is the origin, isn't it, of the Arc de Triomphe, this archway here. It's still got 2 little images of the Roman gods there, and the little mountains at the top. Zeus or Jupiter on one side, and this is Zeus. This is Hera, Juno, the goddess of Olympia.